Welcome to session 11, which focuses on language awareness.
Linguistic form focuses on three main areas: phonology, lexis and syntax. Pause for a moment and think about these words. Can you think of a suitable definition for them? Phonology relates to the sounds in language. Lexis is the focus on words, and syntax focuses on grammatical arrangement of words in sentences. These three elements are essential when focusing on language awareness. Phonology, lexis and syntax are hugely important for learners. Within each separate form, there is a range of language elements that teachers need to demonstrate. For learners to be proficient or to have a better understanding of language, there are further aspects that need to be considered. Take a moment to think specifically of what a learner needs to know with regards to pronunciation, lexis and syntax. Pronunciation is an integral part of language learning. Languages vary greatly and pronunciation can be a real struggle. It often depends on the differences between the native language and English. English is not a phonetic language, and the 26 letters in the alphabet are represented by 44 phonemes of the International Phonetic Alphabet. Intonation is when changes are made in the voice when speaking. These changes are made by rising or falling intonation. Intonation is how we say things, not what we say. It's often referred to as pitch or the music in how we speak. In the first example on the slide of falling intonation, we can look at the full stop to tell us that this is a statement. In the second example, there is a question mark. In spoken language, a rising intonation would show us that this is a question. Pause for a moment and try saying, "She lives in Birmingham," as a statement and as a question. All the pronunciation teaching areas on the slide can determine understanding. If word stress or sentence stress is incorrect, it can be difficult to understand. Fast speech can be a tricky area too. Features of fast speech like elision and assimilation are useful areas to focus on for higher level learners and when focusing on communicative competence. Elision is when sounds disappear in fast speech, like the example of handbag, where the d sound disappears. Assimilation is when consonants change so that we can pass easily from one word to another. Try saying handbag and then 10 boys. Notice how handbag loses the d, and with 10 boys, it sounds like 10 boys. Using the International Phonetic Alphabet often divides opinion. Some teachers prefer to teach pronunciation implicitly whenever issues arise, rather than focusing on specific sounds without adding more confusion to students' learning by introducing another alphabet. With lower level learners, you might not want to give out a whole chart all at once, but you can introduce students to the sounds gradually. Either way, it's important to feel confident using it yourself. Furthermore, learners need to be fully aware that sounds and letters are not the same. Having a copy of the chart in your classroom is a good idea, so you can refer to it as needed. Even if students don't know it, try and integrate it into your teaching. For monolingual classes, focus on the phonemes that prove problematic. Think about any phonemes that your students find difficult. What activity could you prepare to practice effectively? Pause the session to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Let's say you had this picture in a course book. How could you exploit this image to focus on diphthongs? What games or activities could you do? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Simple vocabulary like face, eyes, nose, mouth, ears, smile, boy and hair all focus on diphthongs. Lexical form is another essential element to focus on with language awareness. Think about Lexis and teaching vocabulary as an elicitation tool. Always try and elicit as much as possible from learners when learning a new word or phrase. This is an effective strategy to help learners expand their vocabulary and remember it. Learning a word is not just knowing the meaning and form, but thinking about the 7 things we looked at in the vocabulary session. Think of the word chance. How many features from the slide can you think of related to the word? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. The way in which we put words together to form sentences is called syntax. To communicate effectively, we need to make clear sentences by applying the rules of syntax. Look at the sentence on the slide. The boy walked quickly up the road. Can you name each word in the sentence? Pause for a moment to think about this. We have an article, a noun subject, a verb in the past simple regular form, an adverb, a preposition, another article, and a noun object. Look at the areas of syntax a student needs to learn on the slide. Can you think of examples for each area? How do you approach them in the classroom? Pause the session to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Metalanguage used in syntax and grammar is not always easy to remember. Look at the sentences and underlined features on the slide. How can we define the tenses and language areas? Number 1 is the modal verb may, which is used for giving permission in this sentence. Number 2 shows the use of a phrasal verb, which often have multiple meanings. Number 3 is a question in the present perfect simple tense. This type of question is used to look at life experiences. Number 4 is a first conditional sentence, looking at something that's possible. And number 5 is the definite article, which is always used in English when talking about playing musical instruments. This is a typical error in the language classroom due to interlingual interference. Look at the final 2 sentences. Can you explain the difference? Pause for a moment to think about this. The first sentence is the past simple, and it states that as soon as we arrived at her house, she began to cry. The second example differs, as the first part is the past simple, but the second part is the present perfect continuous, which tells us she had been crying and stopped before we arrived. When we focus on the overall language structure, we need to take into account all of the areas listed on the slide. Form is the first part to focus on when describing the structure and use of English. We need to think about parts of speech, how they are used, and the metalanguage for them. We also need to identify the structure or the tense of the language. How many parts of speech and tenses can you name? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Pronunciation follows. Can students pronounce the word or words correctly? And are they aware of the contracted forms, silent letters, or word stress? Effective teaching practice will always consider anticipated problems that may arise. This will take into account L1 interference and how to deal with issues effectively. Anticipated problems may focus on pronunciation areas like question tags or word order that may differ in English. In a monolingual class, it's relatively easy to incorporate anticipated problems into the lesson plan. Lastly, register. Think about the differences between saying, "Sorry, I do apologise," and "I must apologise." Think about the importance of register in the classroom. What lessons have you taught based on register? Pause the session to think about this for a moment. Teaching principal concepts and terminology will differ from teacher to teacher. The teacher should always take into account the learning styles of the students, and this will determine how language is presented in the classroom setting. This is an ideal way to maximise student talk time, as there's an opportunity to elicit from the learners and then concept check as much as possible. Pause the session and think about the question on the slide and talk to a colleague if possible. What areas do you think students find most difficult? Is it identifying tense, using it correctly, or misunderstandings due to L1 interference? Can students identify time markers, the name of the tense, if a verb is regular or irregular? Can students identify the use of fast native speech and hear the use of a schwa sound? What strategies do you use in the classroom to help students identify key features of language? Pause for a moment to think about this. The use of definitions can help learners remember and consolidate key areas in relation to tense and grammar. You can get them to read definitions and match the tense it's referring to. You should also encourage them to give example sentences when they can. Look through the definitions on the slide and identify the tense in each case. Pause the session while you do this. The first sentence is the past simple. The second, the present simple. The third sentence is present continuous. And the last is future simple. Categorizing language according to grammar, vocabulary, or functional language may help students think about the form of the language, as they have to be able to understand what it is and how it can be used. Categorizing is the first part. The next part is understanding when we should use it and naming the tense or part of speech of the lexical items. Language skills can be categorized into two main areas: receptive skills, which focus on reading and listening, and productive skills, which deal with speaking and writing. Within each skill set area, there are a number of sub-skills that we can focus on. The sub-skills will depend on the student needs and the language focus, but to be proficient in each area, it's best to focus on a range of sub-skills. Look at the sub-skills on the slide and discuss what each one is. Think about methods for teaching the particular sub-skills. Pause for a moment while you think about this. Phonology is an integral part of language learning. Most coursebooks and schemes of work will introduce phonemes individually and then move on to blended sounds. The individual phonemes often depend on the native tongue of the learners and how it differs in English. An effective way to teach individual sounds is to focus on the movement of the mouth. Think about difficult phonemes for your learners. What effective measures do you use to help them produce the correct sounds when they struggle? Many languages do not have the same sounds as English, and training the mouth to move correctly is essential. Minimal pairs are an effective way of working on differences in individual sounds. For example, hit and heat, bit and beat, sit and seat. Similarly, with consonant clusters, students will need a lot of practice. Drilling and playing bingo can be an engaging and motivating way of consolidating the topic. Word stress is about noticing the differences and using them correctly. Questionnaire rods are useful in marking primary stress and secondary stress. Other realia, such as Lego blocks or even different colours, can be used to identify the stress. Fast speech can be a focus on the schwa and weak forms, and then it can move on to more advanced features of fast speech, like elision or assimilation. Intonation requires practice and exposure. Students need help in identifying the differences in intonation. What would you say if a student asks you to explain the rules of intonation? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Intonation is often best taught through examples. Sometimes we can predict intonation based on understanding. So questions that start with a WH sound will have falling intonation. Yes and no questions will have a rising intonation. Help students by using rising and falling arrows and encourage them to identify intonation patterns by using the arrows. Think about the question, what are you doing? How many ways can we say this by changing intonation? Think about emotions like anger or surprise. Phonology can be taught in isolation, but it's often more effective when it's integrated into lessons with a focus on Lexis or grammar. Lexis is the building blocks of the English language. The more vocabulary students know, the better they can speak, listen, read, and write. Remembering vocabulary is the difficult part, and in standard teaching methods, good teachers must go through the vocabulary cycle to ensure new words and phrases remain active rather than passive. So what is the vocabulary cycle? Well, it's a form of repetition. We show the students new words and phrases, then they hear it in a variety of ways. This is consolidation. And once students have remembered it fully and fully understood it, they will be able to produce it actively. It's a good idea to look at words and phrases in a variety of ways to cater for all learning styles. Listen to new words and phrases in a video, or show it through a reading text. Concept check to make sure students are aware of the exact meanings and that they can provide a suitable context or example. Why is concept checking important? When do you normally concept check in the classroom? Pause the session to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Engage students with register by changing a conversation to a formal letter and then to a text message. Notice how we use language in different situations. English is a hugely synonymous language. It's always a good idea to elicit further synonyms and then antonyms so learners can make sure they record them appropriately. Look at the picture on the slide. What can you see? Think about how this picture can be used as an activity for tense revision. Pause for a moment while you think about this. You can use this picture as an elicitation tool and ask questions like, what are they doing? What were they doing? What can you see? What would you be doing if you were in the picture? Pictures are an effective way to consolidate key grammar areas, as they are perfect to elicit and then concept check from the class. Other typical activities may include using time markers correctly for tenses, noticing tenses in a reading text or listening script, and using a grammar auction focusing on mistakes and correction. Have you used a grammar auction in the classroom before? This involves a list of sentences that are correct and incorrect. Students have to work in groups and decide where the mistakes are. It's called an auction as the teachers can use fake money, which allows students to bet on each sentence. So if they're sure a sentence is correct, they put all their money on the sentence. And if they're unsure, they stake less money. Function and meaning often follow a communicative approach in the classroom. This can focus on role-play activities, using a range of functions, or a matching activity like on the slide. Functions can be used to personalise classes according to the needs of the learners. Relevance can also help with student engagement and motivation. With functions, we need to encourage learners to think about what context we use it in and for what reason. Meaning is the actual message the learner is hoping to convey. Meaning can be taught through a range of realia and images to satisfy visual learners. Basic teaching techniques of elicitation and concept checking can be used to ensure understanding. Linguistic form, function and meaning are often integrated in three ways. The first is to look at them explicitly, then move on to focus at the item in a sub-skill using different skill sets. Lastly, a focus according to the level of the learner. So this would be activities and language areas that increase in complexity as the scheme of work or course continues. Look at the examples on the slide and think about how you would approach the phoneme ch. How many ways have you seen linguistic form represented in either a course book or scheme of work? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. One of the main considerations is to consolidate the language area in a variety of ways. This may be according to the scheme of work, but should always take into account the student's learning styles. Often, course books focus on words related to a particular phoneme or phonemes. The same sound is often repeated according to levels. Look at the types of syllabus on the slide. What do you know about them? Pause for a moment while you think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. There are many approaches and types of syllabus that can be used in the language classroom. This often depends on the school, teacher, and student preference. One approach does not suit everybody, and often a blended approach to learning based on the learner's needs is the most effective way to integrate all language areas. The overall effectiveness of any kind of syllabus is how the teacher delivers the content and how teachers integrate areas such as pronunciation, which may not always be covered explicitly. So, a structural approach. This practices both grammatical and lexical structures until they are internalised by the students. This approach can be an effective method, but may be too rigid for some. A functional syllabus is when language is categorised into meaning and function rather than a focus on the grammar and lexis. Functional language teaching can be effective for lower level learners who need certain functions to get by. Lexical may focus on language chunks or collocation. What do we mean when we refer to a chunk of language? It's a group of words together or a phrase that we teach and learn at once, rather than individual words. Do you think learning language in chunks is more effective than learning words in isolation? Pause for a moment while you think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Look at the language on the slide. Can you name each item correctly? Lexis is often categorised into specific areas such as idiom, collocation, simile, metaphor, dependent prepositions, and phrasal verbs. There may be some examples of certain areas in a listening activity or a reading script. Some Lexis is focused around topic-based lessons. Students will have exposure to a range of idioms, for example, but in different themes and contexts. The effectiveness of a lexical approach or a topic-based syllabus depends on the needs of the learners. Should we focus on idioms and language categories, or is it more effective for students to notice them in reading texts, listening scripts, or authentic materials? Pause the session to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Think about the question on the slide with reference to personal teaching experience. Pause for a moment while you think about this. Integrating all language elements into a programme of study can be difficult. As teachers, we use the building blocks of a coursebook or study programme and then supplement for the needs of our learners and specific language areas. Phonology is not always effectively used in programmes of study and can often be neglected. The correct pronunciation can be the difference between being understood or misunderstood. It's an area which needs a lot more focus. Some programmes of study will look at individual sounds or maybe word stress, but pronunciation needs more detailed focus. Lexis is presented differently. Some courses will focus on topic-related vocabulary or present it according to the CEFR level. The use of more authentic study materials can help students acquire new language, and it's a more natural language environment. Grammar is always a part of a programme of study, and it's usually presented by looking at the form, function, and meaning. Nowadays, functional language is a common trend in programmes of study. There's a focus on using language for function following a communicative approach of teaching. Generally, programmes of study and coursebooks have mini glossaries and dictionary resources. This helps with the overall meaning of a language area. There are also many examples and models that students can follow. Regardless of any study programme, teachers are all individual in their style of teaching. It's important to reflect on our teaching and the actual needs of the learners. Pedagogic traditions, according to particular countries, can also play a role in how language is integrated. Think about the questions on the slide. Formative assessment, which includes teaching, learning, and assessment, can be an effective method to assess learners in the classroom. This can include key methodology of concept checking and elicitation as continual assessment in your classroom. Teachers can see who understands and who needs more consolidation. How do you use concept checking and elicitation as an informal assessment tool in your classroom? Reflective assessment, or self-assessment, is where students write up a diary of their understanding of a lesson, language point, or task. This can help the teacher understand how much the learners have understood in a more reflective manner, rather than a very formal assessment. It's a useful task to look at written structure and to pick out key areas. Teacher assessment, which includes assessing class contributions, homework tasks, and general completed tasks. A combination of assessment methods can often be the most effective. Look at some of the traditional assessment methods. Which ones do you use in the classroom? And which ones do you think are the most effective for teaching learners? Pause for a moment while you think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. How do you assess phonology in your classroom? Transcribing a passage in the IPA can be used to see how students are with the relationship between sounds and spelling in English. We can use it to assess at word level, sentence level, or paragraph level, depending on the level of the learners. Some common methods are identifying key phonemes and highlighting them, or alternatively, finding the odd one out. Using a range of assessment tasks is the most effective in assessing overall learning ability. Let's focus on minimal pairs dictation. This is where students have to listen and circle the correct sound. This is an informal way to assess two particular phonemes and can be effective for tricky sounds. Think about what two sounds would be useful for a minimal pair activity with your learners. Intonation can be assessed with a short language function task. Give students a sentence like, "Open the door," and ask them to think of different functions and how that changes the pitch. It could be a request or a command, and intonation will denote that. How do you assess Lexis you use on a regular basis? Look at the example activities on the slide. Are they effective? Do you use them? Teachers should use a range of activities in the classroom to assess learners. The activities should take into account individual learning styles and a range of assessment tools to keep student engagement high. Grammar is often traditionally presented, starting with the present simple, then the continuous tense, before moving on to the past, and so on. Traditional gap fill activities are often used in assessing students' ability to use the tense. Look at the traditional grammar activities as presented on the slide. How effective do you think they are? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Grammar should be a combination of activities to ensure students can actively use and understand the grammar point. Understanding and memorising grammatical rules does not always mean students can produce the actual language. How do you engage and motivate your learners with grammar activities? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Oral assessment and continually assessing students with the classroom can be more effective than gap fill style tasks. Teachers can make notes of key areas students need to work on and use the areas in a peer assessment activity or as a more formal assessment where students have to notice errors that they have made in class. Noticing and self-correcting is very effective and will help students remember how to use the structure or tense correctly more than the teacher correction. Think about your experiences of peer correction in the classroom. Pause the session to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. Think about the points on the slide. What do they mean? And what role do they play with language learners? Pause the session to think about this for a moment. Interlingual interference is when errors are made due to language transfer. This is often referred to as L1 interference, but some students can have interference from more than one language. There are two main elements with interlingual interference: positive transfer and negative transfer. Positive transfer is when there are elements from the native language to English which may have similarities and actually help the learner. Negative transfer is when elements from their native language interfere and they make mistakes in English. Fossilized errors are often a result of interlingual interference. A fossilized error is when a student has made a mistake for a long period of time and has not been corrected. It's then difficult for the learner to break the cycle of using the incorrect form. It's also sometimes a place of contentment for the student. They reach a point of competency where they can communicate effectively, even though they still make mistakes. So they don't see the point or the need of attaining perfection. What are the main areas of interference from your native language to English? Think of one for each category on the slide. What activities have you used in the classroom to help students avoid L1 interference? Pause the session to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. How we combat interlingual interference in the classroom as teachers depends on whether we are teaching monolingual classes or multilingual classes. In a monolingual class, it's easier for the teacher to focus on L1 interference and deal with it. The most effective types of activity are when students have to rely on their English skills rather than their native language. The level of interference depends on prior learning and the general level of the learner. Lower level learners may rely more on their native language, whereas higher level learners may have less interference, but perhaps more fossilized errors. What do you think is the impact of interlingual interference in the classroom? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. In your experience, does grammar or vocabulary normally have the most interference? Pause the session to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. There are often so many areas to focus on in the language classroom. As teachers, we need to decide which areas to tackle and why. Does the mistake impede the meaning or allow for misunderstandings? With some grammar mistakes, we can understand the message the student is trying to get across, but there are lapses of accuracy. This is often due to reliance on their native language, which causes a mistake. Look at the example on the slide. It's easy enough to decipher what the student is trying to say. However, with Lexis, it's a different situation. Mistakes often mean that students are misunderstood completely. What mistakes do your students typically make with lexical items? Pause for a moment to think about this and talk to a colleague if possible. What do you understand by the term false friend? Can you think of any false friends in your language? Pause for a moment while you think about this. Look at the Spanish example on the slide. In this situation, the misuse of language means the learner is not understood, and therefore it's a barrier to effective communication. These are the hashtag words to take from this session. Write a short summary of the session using the hashtag words and examples where possible.